Good evening, everyone. I'm Emma Rose, and I'm so grateful you've joined me tonight. Before we begin, please hit that like button and subscribe. It helps these stories reach the people who need them most. And tell me, what city are you watching from? I love seeing how far our community reaches. This is the story of Miranda Vance, a 52-year-old widow in Savannah who spent a decade drowning in double shifts just to stay afloat. For 8 long years, I believed my exhaustion was the price of my husband's honor. I lived on caffeine willpower and the $500 I sent away every single month, never missing a beat. The nightmare started when my brother-in-law showed up right after Gavin's funeral, claiming there was a hidden debt, a secret burden left to save the family business. I sacrificed my health and every spare cent to protect Gavin's legacy. But on a humid Monday afternoon, the world stopped. I called Wells Fargo for a small home repair loan, clutching my 96th payment receipt in my trembling hands. The voice on the other end was cold and clear. "Ma'am, Gavin Vance never owed a penny. His accounts were cleared the day he died." The phone hit the floor. In that second, 8 years of backbreaking labor turned into a lie. Every meal I skipped, every night I worked until my bones ached, it wasn't for honor. It was for a deception. Tens of thousands of dollars vanished into the pockets of the person I trusted most. Now, alongside my sister Rosemary, I'm going into the darkest corners of the Vance family to find out exactly where that blood money went. Stay with me. This is where the truth fights back. The heavy scent of lilies in the humid Savannah air still makes my stomach turn whenever I think back to that gray afternoon at the cemetery. Standing beside the fresh mound of earth that covered Gavin, I felt like a hollow shell of the woman I used to be just a week prior. The funeral service had ended, and the crowd of mourners began to drift away into the mist, leaving me alone with my grief and my young son. My son Justin Vance stood silently by my side, clutching my hand with a strength that seemed far too heavy for a child of his age. This was the first time Justin had to face the cold reality of loss, and his wide eyes searched my face for a comfort I simply did not have to give. Before I could even process the silence of the graveyard, my brother-in-law Silas Vance approached us with a somber expression that looked carefully rehearsed for the occasion. He was accompanied by his wife Genevieve Vance, who adjusted her black veil with a calculated precision that suggested she was more concerned with her appearance than our shared tragedy. Silas cleared his throat and placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, while his eyes avoided the grave, as if he were afraid the dead might speak. "We need to talk about the burden Gavin left behind, because he made me promise to handle this privately to protect the family name," Silas whispered with a tone that felt strangely urgent. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a stack of yellowed papers filled with Gavin's unmistakable handwriting and descriptions of large cash loans. These documents detailed a series of private transactions from high-interest lenders that Gavin supposedly utilized to keep our family woodworking shop from falling into bankruptcy. Silas explained that my husband had borrowed tens of thousands of dollars in cash from dangerous people who did not care about the grief of a widow or the innocence of a fatherless child. My heart hammered against my ribs as I scanned the scribbled notes while Genevieve stepped closer to lean into my personal space with a suffocating floral perfume. She told me that if these creditors found out Gavin was gone without a plan for repayment, they would strip the house from over our heads before the month ended. Genevieve emphasized that the community in Savannah respected the Vance name, and letting this scandal break would destroy everything Gavin had worked for his entire life. I looked at the signatures on those papers and felt a wave of nausea because they looked so authentic that I never thought to question their legitimacy in my state of shock. Silas promised that he could act as a buffer between me and these invisible creditors if I agreed to pay him directly so he could settle the debts quietly over time. He suggested a monthly payment of $500, which seemed like an impossible sum for a nurse with a young son, but I was too terrified to say no. I looked down at Justin, who was watching Silas with an instinctive frown that I should have recognized as a warning of the deceit unfolding right in front of us. Genevieve reminded me that being a good wife meant protecting a husband's secrets even after he was gone, and she urged me to sign a private commitment letter they had prepared. The pressure of maintaining Gavin's perfect reputation combined with the fear of losing our home made my hand shake as I took the pen Silas offered. I signed my name at the bottom of that cursed document while believing I was securing our future when in reality, I was handing my life over to a pair of wolves. Silas tucked the paper away quickly and told me that I should never mention this arrangement to anyone else, including the bank or the rest of the family. He claimed that involving lawyers or officials would only draw unwanted attention to Gavin's poor financial decisions and shame us all in the eyes of the public. As we walked away from the grave, I felt a crushing weight settle on my chest that had nothing to do with the grief of losing my husband. I watched Silas and Genevieve drive away in their luxury sedan, while I stayed behind to figure out how I would tell Justin that our lives were about to become very difficult. That day marked the beginning of my long descent into a cycle of poverty and exhaustion that would steal 8 years of my life for a debt that never truly existed. I looked at the callous smile Genevieve gave me through the car window, and I realized too late that I had just signed a pact with my own destruction. 3 years after Gavin's death, the vibrant woman I used to be had completely vanished under the crushing weight of a ghost debt that never seemed to diminish. My daily existence had become a blur of sterile hospital hallways and the smell of harsh cleaning chemicals as I juggled 2 exhausting jobs to keep my head above water. I would finish a grueling 12-hour night shift as a nurse, only to head straight across town to scrub floors at a corporate office building before the sun even fully rose. Every muscle in my body ached with a deep and hollow fatigue that sleep could no longer fix because my mind was constantly calculating how to squeeze every penny out of my paycheck. The $500 I handed over to Silas every month felt like a pound of flesh taken directly from my heart, while Justin grew taller in clothes that were starting to fray at the edges. I lived on cold coffee and the cheapest bread I could find, just to ensure that the mysterious creditors Silas mentioned stayed far away from our front door. Genevieve made sure that my fear remained fresh by sending me frantic text messages about suspicious black cars parked near her own house or strangers asking about Gavin's estate. She claimed that Silas was barely holding them back from coming after me directly, and her constant warnings acted like a psychological cage that kept me working until my hands bled. One particularly humid afternoon, the exhaustion finally caught up with me while I was preparing a medication tray in the hospital ward. The fluorescent lights above started to flicker and spin before the world turned into a silent void, and I collapsed onto the cold linoleum floor before my colleagues could reach me. When I finally opened my eyes, I saw the worried face of my best friend Naomi leaning over my bed with an expression that mixed deep affection with visible anger. Naomi had been my rock since high school, and seeing me in a hospital gown because of pure exhaustion was the breaking point for her legendary patience. She grabbed my hand and told me that no debt was worth killing myself over, but I just turned my face away because the shame of Gavin's alleged mistakes felt too heavy to share. Naomi stayed by my side for hours, refusing to let me get up until the doctors confirmed that my blood pressure had stabilized from the extreme stress. A few days later, Silas visited my small house, and I couldn't help but notice the expensive Italian leather shoes he was wearing while he sat on my worn-out sofa. He told me that I needed to stay strong for the family name, while he casually mentioned his plans for a summer vacation in the Florida Keys with Genevieve. I felt a sharp spark of suspicion ignite in my chest as I looked at his manicured hands and compared them to my own cracked and stained fingers. I asked him how he could afford such luxury when he claimed to be helping me settle a massive debt, but he quickly pulled his professional mask back into place. Silas stood up and reminded me that his personal finances were a result of his hard work and that questioning a family member who was protecting me was a sign of disrespect. He used the Vance family legacy like a weapon to silence my doubts and made me feel ungrateful for even noticing the glaring contrast between our lives. I watched him leave in his shiny new SUV while I sat at my kitchen table trying to figure out how to pay for Justin's school supplies after my latest transfer to him. The logic of my situation was starting to crumble, because the more I sacrificed, the more Silas and Genevieve seemed to flourish in their increasingly lavish lifestyle. I spent that night staring at the moonlight on the wall, wondering if Gavin would have ever wanted me to live like a servant in my own life just to pay off a secret. Despite the growing doubts, I was still too terrified of the consequences of stopping the payments because Silas had convinced me that the entire world would judge Gavin if I failed. Naomi continued to check on me daily, but I started hiding the truth from her because I didn't want her to see how truly broken I had become under the pressure. My life had become a performance of endurance where I pretended to be okay for Justin, while I slowly withered away into a shadow of a mother. The $500 was no longer just money, but it was a symbol of my submission to a lie that Silas and Genevieve had carefully woven around my grief. Every time I scrubbed a floor or changed a bandage, I felt the invisible chains of their greed tightening around my neck, while the Savannah heat echoed the stifling nature of my secret. 2 years before the truth finally came to light through that fateful bank call, the fragile peace I had built on lies began to show its first deep cracks. Justin was no longer the quiet child who followed me to the cemetery, but a sharp-eyed teenager who spent far too much time observing the world around him. He noticed the blatant contradictions in the stories Silas told us, while we sat in our cramped kitchen eating leftovers from the hospital cafeteria. My son started showing me social media posts of Silas and Genevieve lounging on private beaches in Aruba, while I was struggling to pay for his basic school textbooks. Justin pointed out that a man supposedly managing a massive family debt should not be able to afford five-star resorts and gold watches every few months. His questions ignited a fire of doubt in my chest that I had been trying to suppress for the sake of my own sanity and Gavin's memory. Around that same time, Naomi found an administrative position at a private clinic that offered much higher pay and better hours than my current grueling night shifts. When I excitedly shared this news during a Sunday dinner, Silas suddenly became very cold and started lecturing me about the dangers of leaving a stable environment. He claimed that the people Gavin owed money to were only staying quiet because of his long-standing influence at my current hospital and the local community. Silas warned me that changing jobs would make those invisible creditors nervous enough to come after me with legal action, or even worse consequences for our home. He effectively sabotaged my chance at a better life by using my fear as a leash to keep me under his thumb and within his financial reach. A few weeks later, I was walking through the downtown parking lot when I saw Genevieve stepping out of a brand new luxury SUV that still had the dealer plates on it. The timing was sickening because the purchase happened exactly 3 days after I had sent Silas an extra-large payment to cover what he called an emergency interest spike. I watched from behind a pillar as Genevieve admired her reflection in the tinted glass while wearing a designer coat that probably cost more than my mortgage. That evening, I finally summoned the courage to visit Silas at his office and asked him to show me the original handwritten debt papers Gavin supposedly signed. I told him that after 6 years of consistent payments, I deserved to see the actual balance and the remaining schedule so I could plan for Justin's college fund. Silas didn't even look up from his desk while he told me that those papers were kept in a high-security safe deposit box for my own protection. He snapped at me for being ungrateful and suggested that my grief was making me paranoid enough to turn against the only family member who cared about my survival. His refusal to show me any physical evidence was the final straw that broke my blind loyalty, and I realized I needed someone else to help me find the truth. I reached out to my younger sister, Chloe Vance, who had always been the most skeptical member of our family when it came to Silas and his grand promises. Chloe didn't say a word, but she immediately started organizing a secret folder where we began to archive every single wire transfer receipt I had ever sent. She spent her weekends at the local library and different bank branches trying to find a way to access Gavin's old financial history without alerting Silas to our movements. We worked in the shadows for months, while I continued to play the role of the exhausted and compliant widow, so Silas wouldn't suspect his bank account was about to be scrutinized. Justin helped his Aunt Chloe by organizing the digital records of every luxury item Genevieve flaunted online to create a timeline of their unexplained wealth. I felt like a double agent in my own life because I was still smiling at Silas during family gatherings, while my sister was slowly building a mountain of evidence against him. The logic of their deception was becoming so obvious that I felt physically ill every time I had to hand over that $500 check at the end of the month. Chloe reminded me that we couldn't strike until we had proof that was undeniable in a court of law, because Silas was a master of talking his way out of trouble. The air in Savannah felt heavier than ever during those months, as the tension between my public submission and my private rebellion grew toward a breaking point. 14 days before the fateful family dinner in Savannah, our quiet rebellion transformed into a high-stakes investigation that demanded absolute precision. Justin spent his nights bathed in the blue glow of his laptop screen, using every digital skill he possessed to follow the money trail I had been feeding Silas for years. He discovered that the bank accounts Silas provided were actually linked to a shell company registered under a maiden name that Genevieve used for her private business ventures. The sophisticated layers of corporate filings were designed to hide the fact that my hard-earned money was being funneled directly into their personal investment portfolio. While my son handled the digital evidence, Chloe reached out to the family lawyer, Mr. Vance, who had served the community for decades with an unblemished reputation. She presented him with the copies of the handwritten notes Silas had used to intimidate me at the cemetery so many years ago. Mr. Vance adjusted his spectacles and sighed deeply as he confirmed that such informal documents would never hold up in a legitimate court of law without notarization. He informed us that the legal framework Silas described was entirely fabricated to exploit my vulnerability during a period of intense mourning. Despite the burning rage consuming my heart, I had to play the role of the exhausted and compliant widow whenever Silas and Genevieve visited our home. I forced myself to smile and offer them tea while keeping my phone hidden in my pocket to record every threatening word that Genevieve whispered when she thought no one was listening. She continued to lecture me about the dangers of the invisible creditors while I sat there silently collecting hours of audio evidence of her psychological manipulation. The turning point came when Chloe arranged a secret meeting at a secluded diner with my husband's former loan officer, Arthur Miller, who had retired shortly after Gavin passed away. Arthur Miller greeted me with a look of genuine confusion because he remembered Gavin as one of the most financially responsible clients he had ever managed in his 30-year career. He reviewed the alleged debt figures and laughed bitterly before explaining that the family woodworking shop was actually showing a significant profit at the time of the accident. Gavin had actually taken out a comprehensive life insurance policy that was supposed to clear all remaining business overheads, leaving me with a clean slate and a secure future. The realization that Silas had likely intercepted those insurance documents to fund his own lifestyle made the air in the diner feel suffocatingly thick. Arthur Miller promised to provide us with the original bank statements from that era, which would prove beyond any doubt that Gavin died with zero outstanding debt. Armed with this devastating truth, we decided to prepare for a public confrontation rather than a private argument that Silas could easily manipulate or deny. Justin created a digital presentation of the bank transfers and the luxury purchases that Genevieve had flaunted on social media during my most difficult financial months. We spent our evenings in Chloe's basement cross-referencing every receipt with the dates of Silas's supposed interest spikes and emergency payments. I felt a strange sense of power returning to my soul as the mountain of evidence grew tall enough to bury the lies that had nearly destroyed my life. The plan was to wait for the upcoming anniversary dinner, where Silas expected me to provide another large payment for the supposed final settlement of the debt. I practiced my calm demeanor in the mirror every morning because I knew that any sign of suspicion would cause Silas to disappear with the money he had stolen. Rosemary and Chloe were instrumental in keeping me grounded, while the pressure of living a double life began to take a toll on my nerves and my sleep. I watched the calendar with a predatory focus because I was no longer the victim they had spent 8 years bleeding dry for their own amusement. Every time Genevieve sent a threatening text, I simply smiled and saved it to the digital file that Justin was protecting with multiple layers of encryption. The 14 days moved with agonizing slowness, but the clarity of our mission provided me with a strength I hadn't felt since before the funeral. We were no longer just a family in mourning because we had become a team of investigators ready to burn down the house of cards Silas had built on Gavin's grave. The tension inside my small living room last Saturday night was thick enough to suffocate anyone who dared to step through the front door. Silas sat on my floral sofa with an air of smug satisfaction, while Genevieve adjusted her expensive jewelry as if she were attending a high society gala instead of a debt settlement. I had invited them over under the pretense of making the final payment that would supposedly clear Gavin's name once and for all. Silas leaned forward and placed a leather folder on the coffee table while explaining that there was an unexpected administrative fee required to officially erase the last traces of the debt. He claimed that an additional $3,000 was necessary to bribe a final creditor who was threatening to leak the story to the local Savannah newspapers. His audacity was truly breathtaking because he watched me with those cold eyes while waiting for another check that he planned to use for his next luxury getaway. I didn't reach for my purse, but instead I pulled out a thick envelope containing the bank statements Chloe had helped me gather over the last several weeks. I looked Silas directly in the eyes and called him by his name for the first time in 8 years without adding the respectful title of a brother-in-law. Silas flinched at the sound of his name falling from my lips with such sharp contempt while I spread the documents across the table for them both to see. I calmly pointed to the suspicious transfers that matched perfectly with the dates of Genevieve's most extravagant shopping sprees at the luxury malls. The silence that followed was heavy and deafening until I played the recording of Genevieve's voice, bragging about how easy it was to manipulate a grieving widow. Genevieve's face turned a sickly shade of red as she realized that her own words were now being used as a weapon to dismantle the life of luxury she had stolen from my sweat. She lost her calculated composure and stood up to scream that I was nothing more than a pathetic and poor nurse who deserved to be exploited for being so gullible. Genevieve shouted that they had earned that money by putting up with my constant mourning and that the Vance family legacy belonged to those who knew how to spend it. By screaming those insults, she effectively admitted to the entire room that every penny I had sent over the last 8 years was a result of their criminal extortion. Silas tried to grab the papers from the table, but Chloe stepped forward to block his path while reminding him that these were only copies of the original evidence. Justin stood quietly in the corner with his smartphone held high to ensure that every second of their confession and their rage was being captured in high definition. My son didn't say a word, but the look of fierce pride in his eyes gave me the strength to stand my ground against the people who had tried to bury me. I informed Silas that the local authorities were already reviewing the files we had compiled, and that a criminal investigation was being launched as we spoke. The smug expression he had worn earlier vanished instantly and was replaced by a look of sheer terror as he realized the consequences of his greed were finally catching up. Genevieve continued to hurl insults at me while her voice cracked with desperation because she knew their social standing in Savannah was about to be obliterated. I watched them scramble to gather their things and leave my house like the common thieves they had always been behind their masks of family loyalty. The air in the room finally felt clean again once the front door slammed shut behind them, and the sound of their luxury car fading away was the sweetest music I had heard in years. We spent the rest of the night reviewing the footage Justin had recorded because we knew this was the steel-clad evidence required for the upcoming legal proceedings. Chloe and I sat at the kitchen table while the weight of 8 years of exhaustion began to lift from my shoulders for the very first time since Gavin's funeral. I realized that I was no longer a victim of the Vance family's greed because I had successfully reclaimed my life and my dignity through the truth. Every drop of sweat I had shed while working those double shifts was no longer a source of shame, but a testament to my survival against their betrayal. The judgment night had finally arrived, and the shadows they had used to cage me were being burned away by the light of the evidence we had gathered together. At 6 o'clock the following morning, the quiet streets of our Savannah neighborhood were illuminated by the rhythmic flashing of blue and red police lights. I stood on my front porch, wrapped in a thin cardigan, while watching 3 patrol cars pull up to the driveway of the grand house Silas had bought with my stolen life. The officers moved with a grim efficiency as they served the arrest warrants that Mr. Vance and the local prosecutor had finalized late the previous night. Silas was led out in handcuffs, wearing only his silk pajamas, while his face looked pale and hollow in the harsh early light of the rising sun. The charges against him were devastating because they included interstate financial fraud and the systematic forgery of government documents over nearly a decade. Genevieve followed closely behind him, her wrists also bound in steel as she faced serious allegations of being a direct accomplice in the extortion scheme. She was accused of knowingly receiving and spending tens of thousands of dollars that she knew had been obtained through the psychological torture of a widow. The local community that once looked up to the Vance family name began to gather on the sidewalks to witness the spectacular fall of their most prominent members. News of their cruelty spread through Savannah like a wildfire through dry brush as neighbors realized the true cost of Silas's luxury cars and designer clothes. The extended family members who had once pressured me to remain silent now turned their backs on Silas and Genevieve with a cold and public fury. While the officers loaded them into the back of the transport vehicles, Silas caught my eye and began to shout desperate pleas for mercy across the lawn. He begged me to consider our shared history and the memory of Gavin, while claiming that he had only intended to protect me from my own financial ignorance. I stood perfectly still and watched him with a level of detachment that I never thought possible after 8 years of living in his shadow. I told him that the time for family loyalty had expired the moment he decided to turn his brother's grave into a personal ATM for his wife's shopping sprees. Genevieve tried to mimic his desperation by sobbing about the future of their children, but her tears felt as artificial as the designer jewelry they had just confiscated. I reminded her that justice in America has no room for the hollow theatricality of criminals who only feel remorse when they are finally caught in their own web. The prosecutor informed me that the court had already issued a restraining order to freeze every single one of Silas's personal and business bank accounts. This legal maneuver was a crucial first step in preparing for the full restitution of the hundreds of thousands of dollars that had been stolen from me. Justin came out to join me on the porch, and he placed a steady hand on my shoulder as we watched the police cars drive away toward the downtown station. My son had played a vital role in this victory, and the look of relief on his young face was worth more than any amount of money we might eventually recover. Chloe arrived shortly after with a thermos of hot coffee and a folder containing the final statements from the bank that proved our victory was absolute. We sat together as the sun fully rose over Savannah, feeling the weight of the past 8 years finally evaporating into the morning mist. The local news channels were already broadcasting the story of the nurse who had taken down a financial predator through sheer persistence and the help of her family. I realized that Gavin's true legacy was not the woodworking shop or the money Silas had tried to hoard, but the strength of the family that remained to fight for the truth. The restitution process would be long and complicated, but knowing that Silas and Genevieve would spend years behind bars provided a peace that no check could ever buy. I looked at the empty spot where their luxury SUV used to sit, and I smiled because the house of cards they built on my grief had finally collapsed into dust. Savannah felt different that morning as the air seemed lighter and the colors of the trees appeared more vibrant than I could remember in a very long time. I was no longer the exhausted widow living on caffeine and fear, because I had finally stepped out of the shadows and into the brilliant light of the truth. Justice had been served at 6 in the morning, and the life I had lost was finally beginning to belong to me once again. A week after Silas and Genevieve were taken into custody to await their trial, the heavy fog that had clouded my life for 8 years finally began to dissipate. The silence in my home no longer felt like a burden of secrets, but instead, it felt like the peaceful beginning of a long overdue rebirth for both Justin and me. I spent those first few days systematically removing every phone number and contact from my life that had any association with the people who stood by while Silas bled me dry. There were distant relatives who had whispered about my struggle behind my back, and acquaintances who had praised Silas for his generosity while I was working double shifts. I realized that reclaiming my freedom meant more than just securing my finances, because it required a complete emotional amputation of those who valued family loyalty over basic human decency. The court had already begun the process of liquidating Silas's frozen assets to ensure that every penny of the stolen $500 a month would eventually return to us. I sat down with Justin to look at college brochures that we previously thought were far beyond our reach because of the artificial debt that had crippled our dreams. Seeing the excitement in his eyes as he discussed studying engineering was a healing balm for the years of guilt I carried for not being able to provide him with a better childhood. We decided to set aside a significant portion of the recovered funds into a protected trust that would ensure Justin never had to experience the financial desperation that nearly destroyed me. Chloe sat with me on the porch one evening and we spoke at length about how this trauma had reshaped our understanding of trust and the hidden dangers of blind devotion. She admitted that watching me wither under Silas's manipulation had taught her that kindness must always be tempered with a sharp and unyielding sense of self-preservation. We agreed that being a member of a family does not grant anyone the right to bypass our boundaries or exploit our vulnerabilities under the guise of protection. The most difficult yet necessary part of my journey occurred on Sunday morning when I drove back to the cemetery where this nightmare had first started 8 years ago. I stood before the marble headstone that bore Gavin's name and felt a profound sense of clarity as I reached into my bag to pull out the stack of old debt receipts. I brought a small metal bowl and a lighter with me because I needed a physical ritual to mark the end of the psychological cage Silas had built around my husband's memory. One by one, I watched the yellowed papers catch fire and turn into gray ash that the gentle Savannah breeze carried away into the tall grass of the graveyard. I told Gavin's spirit that his name was finally clean and that I was no longer the frightened widow who allowed herself to be manipulated by the greed of others. Burning those receipts felt like I was finally burying the version of myself that was too afraid to ask questions or demand the transparency I deserved as a partner. This experience taught me a bitter but essential lesson about financial literacy and the necessity of verifying the truth regardless of who is delivering the information. I understood now that true love does not demand silent suffering, and that those who truly care about us will never use our grief as a tool for their own enrichment. My journey from a victim of a sophisticated scam to a woman in control of her own destiny has been the hardest path I have ever had to walk in my life. As I stood there watching the last ember die out, I felt a strange sense of gratitude for the strength I discovered within myself during the darkest hours of the investigation. I am no longer defined by the debt Silas created or the exhaustion of the night shifts, but by the resilience that allowed me to fight back for the sake of my son. The future is no longer a source of anxiety, but a blank canvas that I am ready to fill with the sounds of laughter and the security of an honest life. I want to express my deepest and most sincere gratitude to every one of you who has taken the time to listen to my story until the very final word. Your presence has served as a reminder that the truth is worth fighting for, and that justice is possible even when the villains are those we once called family. I hope that my struggle serves as a warning and an inspiration for anyone who feels trapped by the manipulation of others, because there is always a way out if you find the courage to look. Thank you for standing with me through this storm and for celebrating the sunrise of a new chapter where I am finally free to be the woman I was always meant to be.